General Charles Bradley did not mean for the entire briefing room to hear him when he scoffed that line about women in fighter jets, but sound had a way of carrying in spaces built from steel and echo, and the words landed in the quiet corner where Amanda Collins was refilling a styrofoam coffee cup, burning themselves into a memory that would replay in her head at 3 in the morning for the rest of her life. Pasted. She kept her eyes on the coffee pot, jaw still, shoulders loose, the way she'd learned to do at Nellis Air Force Base over the last 3 years. Blend in, stay invisible, let arrogance pass through her like wind through a fence. To most people in that room, she was just the admin girl with the neat ponytail and fast-typing fingers, the one who knew where every file lived and where every pilot liked his caffeine on a Monday morning. To Bradley, she was background. To Amanda, who counted time in flight hours and loss, this was purgatory. At 28, Amanda had the kind of face that people underestimated. Soft lines, brown hair tied back in a no-nonsense ponytail, green eyes that watched more than they showed. She dressed like every other civilian support worker on base, in simple slacks and a button-up shirt, badge clipped at her hip, no hint that she could mentally strip and reassemble an F-22 cockpit faster than most of the men in that room could tie a tie. When she walked the corridors of Nellis, past framed photos of pilots standing under their jets with arms folded, past plaques that never seemed to feature a woman at the center, she moved with the quiet, practice gait of someone who had grown used to being underestimated and had decided that, for now, it was safer that way. Her father had never walked quietly anywhere. Colonel James Phantom Collins had filled every hangar with his presence, long before he became a legend whispered about in ready rooms and bars off base. He had flown F-16s when the jet was still new, F-22 Raptors when only a handful of pilots in the world were allowed to climb into the cockpit. His name was tied to missions buried so deep in classified files that even rumors sounded timid around them. To his daughter, though, he'd simply been dad in a faded flight jacket, smelling like jet fuel, coffee, and desert dust, grinning as he lifted her into the rear seat of a trainer and said, "You drive, I'll panic." By the time most kids were learning to parallel park, Amanda was practicing formation drills in worn-out trainers over private airstrips, eating G-forces until her vision tunneled and her dad's approving nod cut through the fatigue. Weekends meant early sunrises and runway heat shimmering like water. She learned to feel air currents in her bones, to read clouds as if they were lines on a map, to sense when an engine wasn't happy just by the vibration under her boots. He drilled her mercilessly on procedures and discipline. A pilot lives or dies on checklists and judgment. He'd say, "You can be scared, but you don't get to be sloppy." She logged hours in Cessnas, then T-38 trainers, then, through favors and strings pulled tight enough to snap careers, she was slipped into backseat opportunities, then secret front seat time under cover of evaluation flights. Each illicit Raptor hour was a stolen gem her father guarded as fiercely as his own reputation. Then one mission over Syria went bad, and an F-22 carrying Phantom Collins vanished from official radar. On paper, it was lost in a catastrophic incident during a classified operation. The reality, like so many things in Amanda's life, became a locked door she could never open. His name was spoken with reverence and politics in the same breath. Casualty lists turned into talking points. Someone somewhere decided that his death created unresolved complications and that the safest place to bury those complications was in the application folder of his only child. When Amanda applied for pilot training, the rejection letter did not mention gender, or politics, or her last name. It talked about current operational constraints and allocation of limited training resources. The subtext, delivered through back-channel whispers, was simpler: "Your file is radioactive." So she moved to Nellis anyway, took the only job they would give her, administrative support in the squadron where her father's friends and rivals still hung their flight suits, because walking away from the flight line felt worse than standing on it with her hands full of paperwork instead of throttles. Every morning at 0600, she unlocked briefing rooms, checked projectors, laid out donuts, poured coffee into paper cups, and listened. Pilots joked about dogfights and altitude blocks, about radar locks and split-S maneuvers. They complained about simulator time, about maintenance delays, about how politics ruined tactics. They talked about women in the Air Force the way some people talk about traffic. Annoying, inevitable, something to be worked around. Bradley, especially, treated the idea of a woman in a fighter cockpit like a punchline someone had once told him, and he never stopped repeating. He had the kind of face recruiters like: sharp features, silver hair, a chest of metals polished to a mirror sheen. Nearing the end of his career, he traded most of his flying time for meetings and briefings, but he still carried himself with the swagger of a man convinced that the sky would collapse without him. He believed in combat the way some men believed in religion: rigid, traditional, hostile to change. The walls of his office told his story: framed combat photos, a model Raptor on his desk, and, for years, a small metal sign that made Amanda's stomach knot every time she saw it. Real pilots don't need GPS. He wasn't joking when he'd add, real pilots don't cry either. And they sure as hell don't wear makeup in the cockpit. Amanda didn't argue. She took notes, scheduled training blocks, and handed him mission briefs. She hid the way her jaw clenched by keeping her head slightly bowed. If he called her young lady in that tone again, she might break something delicate, so she didn't give herself the opportunity. She carried coffee instead of anger where anyone could see it, and when she needed to breathe, she walked the long way around the hangars, where she could smell jet fuel and hear turbines, and remember sitting beside her father as a Raptor climbed into the thin blue at dawn. Other people on base treated her differently. Master Sergeant Thompson, the flight line chief, had the wary respect of someone who'd spent his career around machines that punish mistakes. He noticed how she listened to radio chatter, how she could answer logistics questions with the speed of a pilot calling out a checklist item. Once, when nobody else was around, he'd watched her stand between two Raptors on the line, eyes half closed, tracking an aircraft on final approach, and he thought the posture looked wrong for an admin assistant. Too familiar, too at home. But he said nothing. Suspicion without proof in the military got you a file thicker than your paycheck. On the morning everything changed. The desert sky over Nellis was clear, a hard blue dome with just enough striping clouds to make the sun interesting. Amanda arrived early, like always. She carried a cardboard tray with coffee cups labeled in her neat handwriting, call signs, not names, and a white box of donuts that would vanish within minutes of the pilot sitting down. Inside the main briefing room, screens glowed with tactical maps of the Nevada training ranges. Today's plan: a large-scale exercise, F-22 Raptors playing defenders against incoming aggressor aircraft in F divided by a -18s from the Navy. Simulated missiles. Simulated kills. Real egos. Bradley stood at the front of the room, pointer in hand, explaining the scenario with practiced authority. The pilots lounged in chairs, some with feet on the rungs, some spinning pens between their fingers. Amanda moved up and down the rows, topping up coffee, leaving sugar packets within reach, her presence sliding past their attention like a breeze. She heard every word: engagement ranges, altitude blocks, red and blue air assignments. Her mind, almost against her will, ran through outcomes, counters, angles. Her father's habit. You never just listen to a briefing, he used to say. You fly it in your head while they talk. The scheduled start for the exercise was 1,000 hours. At 0940, she was collecting empty cups near the back of the room when the alarm hit. It started as a sharp, electronic shriek that cut straight through Bradley's lecture. Red strobes along the ceiling began to flash. A half-second later, the base-wide klaxon joined in. That low, unmistakable bellow that turned regular days into bad ones. Chairs scraped back. Pens fell. Every pilot in the room shifted from relaxed to moving in a single breath. The buzz of conversation evaporated. All personnel, this is not an exercise. The base commander's voice came through the overhead speakers, clipped and urgent. Repeat, this is not a drill. We have multiple unidentified aircraft inbound from the southeast. Altitude flight level 350 and descending. Estimated time to reach restricted airspace, 15 minutes. All available pilots to aircraft immediately. Pasted. That line, this is not a drill, landed like a punch. The script the squadron had been rehearsing all morning went out the window. Bradley dropped his pointer, already snapping orders. You heard it. Wheels moving. Now. Full combat loadouts. I want 6 Raptors airborne yesterday. Thompson, scramble crews. The room emptied in a rush of motion. Amanda flattened against the wall as pilots pushed past her, helmets in hand, G-suits hanging half-zipped around their waists. For one aching second, she had the irrational urge to follow them, to join the stream heading for the flight line. Her legs knew that path, even if she'd never taken it with a helmet of her own. Instead, she gathered abandoned folders, cleared the table, and quietly moved to the back, where the wall of windows overlooked part of the tarmac. Outside, the base snapped into coordinated chaos, fuel trucks racing, loaders towing weapons carts, crews scattering towards stationed Raptors. A pair of jets already sat at the hold short line from earlier sorties, engines spinning. This was what the base existed for, the part where the pilots saved the day. Except the pilots were braking. The first sign was minor, a captain she recognized, Reynolds, stumbling just as he reached the bottom of the briefing room steps, one hand grabbing the wall. At first she thought he'd slipped, but then he folded in on himself with a choked curse, sweat already beating at his temple. 2 other pilots bent over him, voices overlapping. Reynolds, talk to me. My gut, Jesus. Another pilot, Foster, made it all the way into the hallway before his kit bag dropped from his shoulder. He slammed a hand against the wall, face draining of color, then clutched his stomach as if something inside had twisted a knife. Within minutes, 3, 4, 5 pilots who had eaten the same off-base dinner the night before were down, leaning against walls, sitting hunched on chairs, faces sick and gray. Medics were called. Stretchers appeared. Not gunfire, not enemy sabotage, just bad food at the worst possible time. A simple, human mistake multiplying through the system. Bradley's voice, usually so steady, spiked. Who's still flight capable? Thompson, breathless, answered from the doorway. So, we can crew 3 Raptors for sure. Maybe a 4th if we push it. But for full coverage of the approach vectors, we need at least 5 in the air. On the main screen, the radar feed had replaced the training map. Red icons, unknown aircraft, march closer in a slow, deadly drift. 15 minutes on the announcement was already shrinking. Bradley stayed at the display. The math was ugly. 3 aircraft guarding a huge chunk of airspace. Limited time, unknown enemy intentions. His jaw clenched. The theater of control he'd maintained for decades cracked, and out of that crack came the sentence that would change his life. Where the hell am I supposed to get more pilots? He snapped. We don't pull them off the street. And we definitely don't pull them out of the front office. Women can't fly Raptors. This isn't some video game. Pasted. The room went quiet, except for the steady, inhuman beep of radar updates. Amanda felt the words hit her like cold water, sharper because she'd heard softer versions of them her whole life. In that moment, she saw not just his contempt, but his fear. And she saw something else, a gap that only she could fill. Her father's voice in memory. One day, kid, you'll get a moment. Maybe just one. It'll be messy, unplanned, inconvenient as hell. You won't be ready. You won't feel ready. But if everything I taught you meant anything, you step into that space. Amanda set the coffee pot down on the nearest table. The faint clink of glass on wood sounded loud in the silence. Then she walked toward the front of the room, past pilots on radios, past techs rushing between consoles, until she stood where Bradley had been moments earlier. General Bradley, she said. Her tone wasn't loud, but it was steady, threaded with something that cut through ambient noise. He turned sharply, annoyed at the interruption, and blinked as if seeing her for the first time. This is not a good time for... I can fly, sir. The words hung in the air. Someone near the back actually laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound that died when Amanda didn't look away. Bradley frowned. What did you just say? She met his gaze. I can fly the F-22. He stared at her as if she'd declared she could flap her arms and reach orbit. Ms. Collins, I don't know what you think this is, but I am not handing a Raptor to a civilian assistant because she watched a documentary. These are combat aircraft worth more than. Colonel James Collins was my father, she said, cutting neatly through his dismissal. Saying his name out loud here, in this room, felt like opening a door she'd been told to keep locked. Call sign Phantom. Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. He trained me from the time I was 16. I have over 800 hours in military aircraft, including classified time in the F-22. I know the systems. I know the tactics. I can fly that jet. Pasted. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. Thompson froze halfway past the doorway and turned slowly. Phantom Collins, he said, voice low. Your father was Phantom. Amanda nodded once. For a man who had spent his career among legends, the flight chief suddenly looked like a kid who'd stumbled into a storybook. So, he said to Bradley, if that's true, Phantom was the best there was. If he trained her. I don't care who trained her, Bradley snapped. But there was a crack in his certainty now. She doesn't have a commission. She's not on any roster. If the Inspector General hears that On the radar screen, the red icons crept closer. A controller called out, voice tight, unidentified aircraft now 12 minutes from restricted airspace. They are descending and spreading across multiple approach vectors. No response to radio challenge. We're out of time for paperwork, sir, Thompson said. Amanda moved toward the gear locker herself, fingers closing around a green flight suit bag before anyone could stop her. You said you need more pilots, she told Bradley. You have one. Use me. Or watch those aircraft fly over us while you argue with yourself. The flight suit slid on like it had been waiting for her. It fit a little differently now. Her shoulders were stronger, her arms more toned from mundane work instead of flight training. But the zippers still came up in one smooth line. She pulled on the G-suit, checked cuffs and connectors with practice touches that came from muscle memory, not guesswork. Her hands shook only once, and the tremor stopped as soon as she focused on the rhythm of the buckles. Bradley watched, torn between protocol and the reality on the radar. If I authorize this and you crash, that's my career. If I don't and those aircraft hit this base, that's more than a career. He swallowed. This is insane. What's more insane? Amanda asked quietly. Letting ego ground a capable pilot while enemy aircraft close in, or giving that pilot a chance to do exactly what she's trained her whole life to do. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the alarm and the steady updates from the radar station. The clock was moving. Thompson made the call, like a man stepping over a line drawn too long ago. So, I'll take responsibility for prepping the jet and clearing the crew. If she can't start the bird, we shut her down and it's over. But if she can. He left the sentence unfinished. Bradley looked at the radar, then at Amanda, then at the door leading outside. His jaw clenched once. Fine, he said hoarsely. One aircraft. You step out of line once. I abort the launch. Is that understood, Ms. Collins? Yes, sir, she said. Her heart hammered, but her voice came out level. Call sign Ghost Falcon. He blinked. You don't have a call sign. I do now, she said, and walked out toward the flight line. The desert heat hit her like a solid wall as she stepped outside, the familiar scorch of mid-morning Nevada sun baking the tarmac into a shimmering mirror. Hangars loomed, jets glinted, crews ran. Thompson caught up with her, handing over a helmet. You sure? He asked, voice pitched low so others wouldn't hear the doubt buried under respect. No, she answered honestly. But the aircraft is. That's enough. He stayed at her for half a second, then nodded. You're taking Raptor 074143. Fully fueled, live ordnance. We were prepping her for the exercise. I'll clear maintenance on the net. The jet waited at the edge of the apron, all sharp lines and predatory angles, gray skin catching the sun. Amanda drew closer and felt something inside her loosen. The F-22 had a presence up close, like standing beside a coiled animal. She ran a hand lightly along the fuselage as she climbed the ladder, not for show, but because it was what her father had always done, acknowledge the machine carrying him into the sky. In the cockpit, everything was both familiar and new. Glass displays, switches, the HUD ring. She'd been here before, under supervised circumstances so hush-hush they'd never appear on any official record. Her fingertips moved from memory, battery on, auxiliary power, avionics suite online. Her voice was calm on the radio. Power. This is Ghost Falcon, aircraft 074143. Requesting startup clearance for immediate scramble. Up in the control tower, men who'd never learned her name stared at each other. Bradley lifted a headset, eyes still on the radar feed. Ghost Falcon, tower. You are cleared for engine start and taxi. You will follow all tower vectors. No cowboy stunts. Confirm. Copy, tower, Amanda replied, lips curling very slightly at the choice of words. No cowboy stunts. Engine spooled up with a rising whine, settling into a thunder she felt through the seat and into her bones. As the systems came alive, she watched the diagnostic displays light green one by one. No anomalies. No error codes. This machine wanted to fly. She eased the throttles forward, the jet beginning to roll, guided by marshaller signals and tower instructions, weaving past other aircraft and blinking ground lights. Ghost Falcon, tower. Taxi to runway 21 left. You're number 1 for immediate departure. Wind calm, visibility unlimited. On her canopy glass, the Nevada sky stretched wide and blue. The weight of what she was about to do pressed on her chest. The illegality of it, the career risk, the sheer enormity of stepping into a battle the Air Force had never written her into. Behind that weight, another voice, her father's, laughing softly from some remembered weekend in an old hangar. You don't belong in the stands, kid. You belong in the arena. At the threshold of the runway, she held the brakes and ran up the engines, feeling them strain. Everything vibrated, the world shrinking down to nose pointed at open asphalt and the thin green line of HUD data in front of her eyes. Ghost Falcon, cleared for takeoff, came the tower's voice. Runway 21 left. Fly heading 170 after departure. Climb and maintain flight level 400. Vectors to intercept on climb out. Ghost Falcon rolling, Amanda replied. She released the brakes and pushed the throttles to military power, then a notch beyond into afterburner. The jet punched forward, runway markings blurring, acceleration pressing her back into the seat. Airspeed numbers climbed, 80 knots, 120, 160. At rotation speed she eased back on the stick, letting the nose lift. The jet left the ground smoother than any dream she'd ever had, wheels tucking away, desert shrinking beneath her. In the tower, a row of pilots watched through glass as the coffee girl flew a departure that looked like it belonged in a training video. No drift off centerline, climb angle precise, gear retracted at just the right moment. A captain muttered something under his breath. Thompson just stood with his arms folded, jaw set in strange pride and fear. Bradley said nothing. Amanda climbed through 20,000 feet, the world flattening into layered blues and browns below. The radar display on her console began to populate with returns, the friendly ground radar feeding targets to her. 6 contacts, heading northwest, descending slightly, spreading into a fan. They weren't squawking friendly codes. Their speed was wrong for the scheduled Navy aggressors. Their pattern was wrong for an exercise. Tower. Ghost Falcon, she said. I have 6 bogies at bearing 135, range 60 miles. Angels 35 and decreasing. No IFF response. These are not our scheduled adversaries. Ghost Falcon, tower. Training flights from Fallon canceled due to pilot illness, the controller answered, confirming what she already knew from the chaos below. No friendly aircraft are expected in your vicinity. You are cleared to treat unknowns as hostile if they enter restricted airspace and ignore further warnings. Rules of engagement. Defensive intercept. Copy. Copy, tower, Amanda said. Her voice stayed calm, but goosebumps prickled under her flight suit. This was not simulated. If she pulled the trigger today, people would die. Pilots, like her father. Men whose faces she would never see. She thought of him again, in a dusty office, bent over mission maps, telling her that sometimes the best way to honor a pilot was to make sure he never reached his target. Lives on the ground counted, too. The enemy had chosen to be there. The families under their flight path had not. She leveled at 40,000 feet and pushed the throttle, letting the Raptor's engines pull her toward the contacts. The minutes slipped by, counted out by calls from the radar controllers and the soft, regular sound of air rushing past the canopy. Her breathing remained steady. Her heart raced, but her hands did not shake. Training, again and again, in old trainers and borrowed jets, had burned away the part of her that wanted to flinch. As she closed within weapon's envelope, the 6 unknown aircraft reacted. Their formation tightened, then split into 2 elements, 4 angling slightly high, 2 diving lower. A pincer movement, one group to distract, another to slip under the radar picture. Whoever was flying them knew what they were doing. Ghost Falcon, Tower, came the controller. Bogies now within 40 miles. No response to standard hails. You are weapons free if they enter restricted airspace. Ground assets are at risk. This was the moment that separated simulations from combat. In the sim, you knew you couldn't bleed. Hey, if she misjudged, someone would. Amanda eased the jet slightly above the enemy's altitude, letting her stealth profile work for her. The F-22 was built to be a ghost in the sky. Used right, it let you strike like one. Her father had drilled that mindset into her, long before she was old enough to vote. Don't fight, Faye. Fight smart. The only rule is you come home. She locked the lead aircraft in the 4-ship element first. No chatter on the radio. No call signs. Just silent red icons. Her thumb hovered over the weapons release. The range ticked down. Ghost Falcon, status. In position, she said. Engaging. She squeezed. The jet shuddered as an AIM-120 AMRAAM left its rail, streaking out ahead, invisible except on the screen. At this altitude, at this range, the enemy pilot had seconds to realize he was in a fight before physics decided the outcome. The radar spike on her display flared, then vanished. A small, cold tone signaled impact. 1 hostile destroyed, she reported. Her voice remained level. Inside, a knot tightened. That was a real aircraft, a real human being. There was no time for mourning, not yet. The formation scattered. The remaining 5 aircraft broke hard. 1 high, 2 rolling low, 2 side-slipping outward, trying to force her into a bad angle. Maneuvering icons swirled on her screen. She didn't chase blindly. She climbed, rolled, came over the top, using altitude as her ally. Her father's training, relentless and sometimes harsh, clicked into place. You don't chase bait. You own the sky and make them react to you. Back at Nellis, radar operators stared at their scopes as 1 red dot disappeared. Then the formation fractured. Bradley, hands on the console edge, watched the tracks and heard Amanda's calm callouts. He couldn't reconcile the woman speaking on the net with the one who had been quietly stacking paper in his office for 3 years. On the next pass, Amanda forced 2 of the enemy aircraft into a turn that bled their speed. She rolled behind them with a high-G maneuver that pressed her into the seat, vision dimming at the edges. She leaned into anti-G breathing techniques without even thinking about it. The second missile left the rail. Then a third. On the scope, 2 more red returns winked out. 3 hostiles down, she reported. Her jet shivered as she pulled another turn, keeping the remaining aircraft in her forward quarter. They tried to reverse rolls, forcing her defensive, but she refused the bait, keeping altitude, using the Raptor's advantage in thrust and stealth. A 4th and 5th missile left her jet, guided by a mix of onboard and offboard targeting. Another red icon vanished. Then another. 5 bandits destroyed. 1 remaining, low, heading for the base, she said. The last pilot had made a choice. Ignore the fight and push for his target. On radar, his track line pointed directly toward the zone Nellis defended. Whatever his mission was, he seemed determined to complete it, even if it meant ignoring the threat behind him. Amanda throttled back, dropped her nose, and dove. The sky turned from pale blue to deeper shades as she cut down through the higher layers, Mach numbers climbing. The Raptor shook lightly with the air resistance, but her hand stayed steady on the stick. Ghost Falcon, is at 20 miles and closing, the controller called. You are the only line between him and the base. Understood, she replied. She let the closing distance compress, waiting until the last possible safe moment to lock before firing. She didn't want debris falling anywhere near the base. At range, Low altitude over empty desert. She thumbed the trigger one last time. The missile leaped out ahead, guiding on its own silent brain. Her eyes tracked the HUD numbers, then flicked to a faint burst on the horizon, a small smear of smoke and flame against the pale ground. Hostile 6 destroyed, she said. No further tracks on radar within engagement zone. Silence answered her for 2 heartbeats. Then the control room erupted in overlapping cheers, muttered curses of relief, disbelieving laughter. In the tower, Bradley closed his eyes and exhaled sharply, some deep tension leaving his shoulders. "Ghost Falcon," he said into the MIC, voice low. "This is Tower. Outstanding work. Base is secure." "Copy that, Tower," Amanda replied. The adrenaline still roared through her veins, but she forced herself to go methodically through post-engagement checks. Weapons status. Fuel. Systems. Nothing critical. Request vectors for RTB. They brought her home like they would any other pilot, feeding headings and altitudes, slotting her into the pattern. As she turned onto final, the runway stretched out ahead, lines painted with the same precise care her father had admired years before. She held the glide slope steady, flared at just the right moment, and let the Raptor's wheels kiss the asphalt with the soft, brief chirp of a perfect landing. Taxiing back, she saw something she'd never seen before. Nearly every available set of eyes on base turned toward her. Mechanics lined the edges of the ramp. Pilots, some pale and sweating, had dragged themselves out to the windows or railings. Security forces stood in a rough semicircle. The ground crew guided her into position, chocks in, engines spooling down, until silence slowly replaced the howl of turbines. When the canopy opened, hot desert air swept in. Amanda unstrapped, pulled off her helmet, and climbed down the ladder into a wall of eyes. She felt a strange detachment, as if watching someone else descend. Someone taller, someone dressed in legend instead of borrowed authority. Bradley pushed through the crowd, hat in hand. Up close, the lines on his face were deeper than she'd ever noticed. For once, he looked less like a recruiting poster and more like a tired man who had spent his life giving orders and now wasn't sure what to say. He stopped a few feet from her boots and looked up. There was a long beat where nobody spoke. Then the general, who had belittled her every morning for years with casual comments about coffee and support roles, did something nobody present would forget. He straightened his spine, brought his hand up, and saluted her. It wasn't a lazy, ceremonial gesture. It was crisp, perfect, textbook, the kind of salute a junior officer might dream of receiving from a senior who truly meant it. "Amanda Collins," he said, the word carrying clearly across the flight line. "On behalf of this base and every soul you just protected, I owe you my thanks and my apology. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what a real pilot looks like." The crowd was silent. Somewhere off to the side, a tool clanged against concrete as somebody's hand slipped, but nobody turned to look. All attention stayed on the woman in the flight suit and the man offering her a respect that rank alone couldn't command. Amanda returned the salute, the motion automatic and precise, learned in 1,000 private sessions with a father who had taught her customs and courtesies long before the Air Force officially would. "Sir," she said quietly. The word carried no submission, only acknowledgement. "My father always said the sky doesn't care what we think a pilot looks like. It only cares who can fly." Later, the paperwork would be a nightmare. There would be inquiries and memos and uncomfortable conversations in rooms with flags behind desks. Lawyers would argue about liability, about how a civilian had taken off in a Raptor, about what it meant for chain of command. Bradley would sit through all of it. When asked if he had authorized the flight, he would answer yes. When pressed on whether he had believed she could handle it, he would admit he hadn't known, but he had trusted what he saw when she moved through checklists with a fluency he couldn't ignore and when the radar feed began dropping enemy tracks like stones. The Air Force was a system that didn't like surprises, especially when they exposed blind spots in its own policies. Yet even systems that old and rigid could be forced, by events, to bend. Investigators talked to Thompson, to the radar operators, to maintenance crews who swore under oath that they'd never seen anything like the way she'd flown. that it had been like watching phantom Collins in the sky again. Ultimately, the question shifted from how did this happen to what do we do with her now? The answer, in the end, came down to simple math. An airbase had been targeted. 6 hostile aircraft had been destroyed with no friendly losses. The pilot responsible had flown in clear communication with the tower and followed lawful orders under emergency authority. The fact that she had done so without a pre-existing commission made the legal framework messy, but not impossible. A pathway existed, seldom used, for battlefield commissions and retroactive recognition of qualifications in extraordinary circumstances. Someone dusted off that provision. 3 months after the day her life split neatly into a before and after, Amanda stood in a freshly pressed uniform in a hangar filled with people. This time, she wasn't handing out coffee. Planes gleamed behind her, lined up as if watching. A small podium had been rolled into place. Flags hung along the wall. The same faces that had once glanced past her now watched with focused attention. General Bradley stepped up to the microphone, the ribbons on his chest catching the overhead lights. "There are moments," he began, voice steady, "when an institution meets a person it doesn't know how to recognize. Sometimes that institution is wrong. Sometimes, if we're lucky, it gets the chance to correct itself." He spoke briefly about the attack, what he could say in an unclassified setting, then about the actions taken by a civilian administrative assistant who had stepped into a Raptor cockpit and defended the base as if she had been doing it her entire career. He did not mention his own earlier words about women and fighter jets, but the silence around that omission said enough. Everyone who had been there remembered. "Today," he concluded, "we recognize that talent and courage are not limited by our assumptions. By order of the Secretary of the Air Force, Ms. Amanda Collins is hereby commissioned as Captain, United States Air Force, and assigned as a pilot in the 422nd Fighter Squadron." He turned to her, holding out the rank insignia. For a moment their eyes met. The apology he had given her on the tarmac deepened into something more complicated. Respect, maybe, and a kind of gratitude tinged with shame. She accepted the bars, feeling their weight against her palms. When she spoke, she kept her words short. Long speeches didn't suit her. "My father loved this uniform," she said. "He taught me that flying isn't just skill, it's responsibility. I'll do my best to honor that responsibility and the trust you're giving me today." After the ceremony, she walked with Thompson back toward the hangars. He carried a folder tucked under one arm, his expression relaxed for the first time in weeks. "You know," he said, "I had a feeling about you." "No, you didn't," she replied, a small smile tugging her lips. He chuckled. "All right, maybe not at first, but I saw the way you watched the radar, the way you moved on the flight line. The signs were there. The signs were there for everyone," she said. "They just weren't looking." She took on her new role quietly. The squadron was not magically transformed overnight into a haven of progressive thinking. Some of the older pilots watched her with wary curiosity, waiting for mistakes. Some of the younger ones, raised on different expectations, approached her with open minds and endless questions. She answered the ones worth answering and ignored the rest. In simulators, she dissected bad habits with surgical precision. "Your flying like this is about your ego," she told one lieutenant after he tried to outturn an imaginary threat and ended up virtual debris. "It's not. It's about the people below you who don't have ejection seats." When she took students up in dual-seat trainers for the first time, she saw nerves behind bravado, remembered her own knotted stomach at 16, the way her father had squeezed her shoulder just once before telling her to move the stick like she meant it. She didn't imitate his style exactly. He had been harder, sometimes to the point of harshness. She chose a different balance, demanding, but precise, always tying technical maneuvers back to real stakes. "You missed that intercept," she would say, tracing a finger across a map, "and that's a town. That's a convoy. That's someone's home." The story of Ghost Falcon traveled faster than any official memo. It moved between bases, across hangar floors, through pilots' lounges in fragments and exaggerations. The details warped with each retelling, as stories do. Some swore she'd taken on 12 enemy jets alone, some claimed she'd flown without a radar picture at all. But one detail remained constant in every version, that when nobody else could launch, the quiet woman from the front office had climbed into the Raptor and flown like a ghost out of nowhere to protect the people who had never bothered to lane her name. In Bradley's office, the old metal sign about real pilots disappeared the week after her commissioning. In its place, a simple framed line appeared, stenciled on matte background. Real pilots earn respect in the SKY, not with words on the ground. He didn't make a speech about it. He didn't call attention to the change. But every person who entered his office noticed. Sometimes, in the quiet after a long training day, Amanda would walk the flight line alone, the heat of the day bleeding out of the concrete under her boots. She'd stop beside aircraft 074143, now officially designated Ghost Falcon on the maintenance logs, a small nod from superstitious crew chiefs who like their machines to have stories. She'd rest a hand on the fuselage and let herself remember that first climb, the hollowness in her chest as she accepted that real people would die because of her decisions, and the strange, fierce calm that had settled over everything once she accepted it. She never bragged about what she'd done. She didn't need to. The flight data recorder, the radar tapes, and the memories of everyone in that tower did the talking. At night, in her small off-base apartment, she kept one photo by her bed, her father standing beside an older jet, grin wide, arms slung around a teenager in an oversized helmet. The desert sky behind them looked almost identical to the one she'd flown through on the day of the attack. She would look at it sometimes and murmur a single sentence into the quiet. "I flew, Dad." There was no answer, of course. Just the steady hum of the refrigerator, the faint whine of jets in the distance, the sound of a base living another ordinary night because, on one extraordinary morning, someone the system had dismissed as background noise had stepped forward when it mattered. Years later, new recruits at Nellis would be told a version of the story during informal hangar briefings. They would hear that once there had been a woman who ran copies and coffee, who had more hours in a cockpit than many of the men teasing her, and who had proven that prejudice wasn't just ugly, it was dangerous. Instructors would point to the tarmac where her jet had sat and say, "That's where the base learned the hard way that you never underestimate quiet people with training." And somewhere in the background, moving between simulators and mission planning rooms, a captain with green eyes and a neat ponytail would listen, half amused, as a legend grew beyond what actually happened. She'd correct the worst exaggerations and ignore the rest. The only part that mattered to her was simple. 6 enemy aircraft had not reached their objective. The base had remained secure. The people who'd never seen those red icons on radar went home that night without knowing how close danger had come. On the books, the mission would be summed up in a handful of lines, buried in reports. Emergency intercept conducted under compressed timeline. Hostile aircraft neutralized. No friendly casualties. It would not capture the exact tone in Bradley's voice when he saluted her, or the way Thompson's eyes had shone with grudging pride, or the moment Amanda had set the coffee pot down and decided that, no matter what happened to her career, she would not stand in the background while others fought a battle she was born and trained to face. Those details lived in the memories of the people who had been there. They also lived in Amanda's quiet, unassuming presence, in every checklist she ran with a student, in every subtle correction she made when a new pilot's ego started to run ahead of their judgment. The day of the attack was not the end of her story, just the first day anyone else had bothered to pay attention. Long before any general's face went pale watching her on a radar screen, before a heaving base gathered around a single Raptor on hot concrete, there had been a girl standing on a small airstrip with her father, sunlight in her eyes, a flight helmet too big for her head, listening as he told her that the sky belonged to those brave enough and disciplined enough to claim it. That lesson, carried for years through rejection and invisibility, had waited for its moment. When it finally came, she met it head-on at 40,000 feet with a live weapons load and a calm voice over the radio. And from that day on, at a desert base where people once joked that women couldn't fly fighter jets, the smartest pilots began to look twice at the quiet faces in the back of the room, wondering which of them might be the next ghost waiting for a chance to step into the cockpit and change everything.